November 1966, a Nui Dat base in Phuoc Thu Province, South Vietnam. The air hung thick with diesel fumes and monsoon humidity as a team of Australian SAS operators returned from a 14-day patrol deep in Viet Cong territory. American advisors gathered to observe their debriefing. What they saw made their blood run cold. The Australians carrying AK-47s, Chinese grenades, NVA field packs, captured enemy equipment covered in mud and blood. One U.S. colonel turned to his intelligence officer and said what everyone was thinking. These men were fighting with the enemy's tools, in the enemy's way, violating every principle of modern warfare. 4 years later, those same Australians had achieved kill ratios exceeding 100-1, while American units struggled to reach 3-1. The Pentagon called the statistics impossible. Military analysts declared the methodology unsound. Geneva Convention experts questioned the legality. You think you know unconventional warfare? You're wrong. Why did elite soldiers abandon the finest weapons American industry could produce? How did captured equipment become more valuable than cutting-edge technology? What made these operators so effective that their own allies called them dishonorable, while their enemies called them ghosts? Stay until the end, because what happened in those jungles challenged every assumption about military superiority and revealed a truth about warfare that no amount of industrial power could overcome. The scene at Nui Dat repeated itself across every firebase where Australian SAS operated alongside American forces. The contrast was jarring and uncomfortable. American soldiers carried M16 rifles fresh from factory production lines. They wore standardized uniforms treated with insect repellent. They used American grenades, American ammunition, American everything. The supply chain stretched from Detroit to the Mekong Delta, and industrial artery pumping equipment to soldiers who trusted that American manufacturing superiority would translate to battlefield superiority. Then the Australians would emerge from the jungle, carrying weapons stamped with Cyrillic characters and Chinese ideograms, wearing modified enemy webbing, using ammunition manufactured in communist nations. The Americans were shocked. The shock turned suspicion. The suspicion turned to accusations. The accusations focused on honor and professionalism. American military culture in 1966 was built on clear distinctions. We used our weapons. They used theirs. We maintained standards. They operated in moral ambiguity. The idea that Allied special forces would deliberately choose enemy equipment violated fundamental assumptions about what it meant to be a professional soldier. American officers filed complaints. Intelligence reports questioned Australian reliability. Some suggested the Australians were compromised. Others simply called them reckless cowboys who would get everyone killed. The criticisms were harsh and rooted in genuine concern. They were also completely wrong about why the Australians made the choices they made. The Australian SAS arrived in Vietnam in 1966, carrying institutional knowledge that American forces lacked. Australian military culture had been shaped by 20 years of jungle warfare in conditions where conventional approaches failed consistently. They had fought in New Guinea during World War II, learning that American equipment was designed for American doctrine, and American doctrine did not always work in tropical jungles. They had fought in Malaya during the emergency, learning that counterinsurgency required thinking like insurgents. They had fought in Borneo during confrontation, learning that the best intelligence came from captured enemy supplies, and the best camouflage came from looking exactly like the enemy until the moment you open fire. 20 years of hard lessons produced methodology that seemed insane to soldiers whose only reference was conventional warfare. The decision to use captured weapons was not casual or reckless. It was calculated and ruthlessly practical. The Australian SAS operated in small teams, typically 5 men, inserted deep into enemy-controlled territory for patrols lasting 2 weeks or more. They were outnumbered 100 to 1. They had no quick reaction force available for rescue. They had no artillery support within range. They were alone in a hostile jungle, surrounded by enemy forces who knew the terrain intimately. In those circumstances, every tactical advantage mattered. Every edge increased survival probability. The Australians made a simple calculation. Captured weapons provided advantages that outweighed the risks. American equipment, despite its technological superiority, created disadvantages that got soldiers killed. The AK-47 became the symbol of Australian tactical thinking. The weapon was crude by American standards. Loose tolerances, heavy recoil, lower accuracy at range. American military analysts dismissed it as inferior to the M16 in every measurable category. But the Australians measured different categories. The AK-47 functioned in mud, water, and filth that jammed the M16. The AK-47 used 7.62 x 39 millimeters ammunition that could be resupplied from every dead enemy soldier encountered during patrol. The AK-47 made the same sound as enemy weapons, providing acoustic camouflage that confused opposing forces about who was shooting and from where. The AK-47 was heavier than the M16, which meant it was more stable during automatic fire at close range in the jungle, where engagement distances were measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters. Every disadvantage in conventional warfare became an advantage in the specific circumstances where Australian SAS operated. The transformation in Australian thinking had occurred gradually across multiple conflicts. In New Guinea, during World War II, Australian soldiers learned that Japanese equipment was better adapted to tropical conditions than American or British equivalents. Japanese soldiers carried lighter loads. Their rice rations lasted longer than Western food. Their jungle boots performed better in mud. The Australians started adopting enemy techniques and equipment, not from admiration, but from recognition that the enemy had solved problems the Allies were still struggling with. The practice was controversial. British officers called it unprofessional, but Australian soldiers were practical. They cared about survival more than appearances. The practice accelerated in Malaya. The British were fighting communist insurgents who moved through jungle like ghosts and ambushed patrols from positions that seemed impossible. The communist terrorists used captured British weapons alongside Chinese and Soviet equipment. They wore mixtures of military and civilian clothing. They cached supplies in unmarked locations throughout the jungle. The British forces tried to fight conventionally and struggled. The Australian SAS, newly formed and eager to prove themselves, tried something different. They started thinking like the enemy, moving like the enemy, using enemy techniques. The results were immediate and dramatic. Australian patrols started finding enemy camps and supply caches. They started winning engagements. The methodology worked because it eliminated the advantages that made insurgents effective. By the time Australian SAS deployed to Vietnam in 1966, the methodology was refined and proven. The soldiers arriving at Nui Dat were not experimenting. They were implementing lessons learned through 2 decades of jungle warfare. They knew what worked. They knew what got soldiers killed. They knew that American doctrine, built around firepower and technology, was poorly suited to counterinsurgency in dense jungle against an enemy who refused to fight conventionally. So they implemented their own doctrine, built around stealth and adaptation, using whatever tools provided tactical advantage regardless of origin. The first major operation that showcased Australian methodology occurred in February 1967. An Australian SAS patrol of 5 men was inserted into Phuoc Thu Province to locate a suspected Viet Cong base camp. The patrol carried a mixture of weapons. The patrol leader and point man carried suppressed Sterling submachine guns of British manufacture. 2 team members carried AK-47s taken from dead NVA soldiers during previous operations. The 5th man carried an M16 as backup and for communication purposes, since American helicopters identified friendly forces partly by weapon sounds during extraction. The mixture was deliberate. Each weapon served a specific purpose within patrol. Tactics. The patrol located the base camp on day 3. They observed it for 4 days, counting enemy personnel, noting supply patterns, and mapping defensive positions. On day 7, they executed a raid that destroyed ammunition supplies, killed 17 VC, and withdrew without casualties. The after-action report detailed their success. It also detailed their weapons. American intelligence officers reading the report were disturbed. Australian soldiers had entered American-controlled airspace carrying enemy weapons. They had engaged enemy forces using communist ammunition. They had violated standing orders that required Allied forces to carry identifiable friendly weapons. The intelligence officers demanded an explanation. The Australian SAS commander provided an explanation that satisfied no one. His soldiers used captured weapons because captured weapons were tactically superior for their mission profile. The AK-47 provided acoustic deception. Enemy forces hearing. AK fire assumed they were hearing their own side and hesitated before responding. That hesitation provided seconds of advantage during ambushes when seconds meant life or death. The AK-47 eliminated supply chain dependence. Patrols could resupply from enemy dead, extending operational duration without requesting resupply drops that revealed patrol positions. The AK-47 was more reliable than the M16 in tropical conditions. Jammed weapons got soldiers killed. Reliable weapons kept soldiers alive. The explanation was logical and practical. American officers hated every word. The hatred was cultural and institutional. American military culture valued standardization and uniformity. Every soldier equipped identically meant simplified logistics and clear identification. The American military industry produced weapons in massive quantities with expectation that those weapons would be used. Not using American weapons suggested American weapons were inferior. Suggesting American weapons were inferior was unthinkable. The institutional investment in American military superiority was so complete that alternative approaches were interpreted as criticisms rather than adaptations. The Australians were not criticizing. They were surviving. But the distinction was lost in translation between military cultures that operated on different, fundamental assumptions. The AK-47 appeared in more and more Australian patrol reports. Through 1967, intelligence summaries noted the trend with increasing concern. Some American commanders demanded that Australian SAS be prohibited from using captured weapons. MacArthur's old headquarters policies from World War II were cited, policies that had required Allied forces to use standard equipment for identification. Purposes. The Australian commander refused the demands. His soldiers would use whatever weapons maximized their effectiveness and survival. If American forces were uncomfortable with that reality, the Australians would operate independently in their assigned province. The standoff created tension, but the Australians had leverage. Their kill ratios and mission success rates were dramatically higher than comparable American special operations units. The results spoke louder than the controversy. The controversy intensified after an incident in August 1967. An Australian patrol ambushed a Viet Cong squad using AK-47s and captured Chinese grenades. The VC, hearing familiar weapon sounds, walked into the killing zone without defensive posture. All 11 VC were killed before they could return effective fire. The engagement lasted 40 seconds. The Australian patrol withdrew without being detected by nearby enemy forces, who assumed the brief firefight was accidental discharge or friendly fire incident. The after-action report described the ambush in detail. American analysts reading the report were split. Some recognized the tactical brilliance. Others saw what they considered deception bordering on war crime. The question of legality became contentious. Geneva Conventions contained complex provisions about perfidy and ruses of war. Using enemy uniforms to commit violence was prohibited. Using enemy weapons existed in a gray area. Legal experts disagreed about whether acoustic deception through captured weapons constituted illegal perfidy. The debate was theoretical and bloodless. For Australian soldiers operating in circumstances where mistakes meant death, the debate was irrelevant. They would use any tactic that was effective and not clearly prohibited. The legal ambiguity was acceptable. Getting killed because you followed peacetime legal interpretations was not acceptable. The American military could not reconcile Australian practices with their own doctrine. American special forces were trained to operate behind enemy lines, using American equipment, American tactics, American everything. The idea that effectiveness might require abandoning American methods was too threatening to institutional identity. Some American special operations personnel privately admired the Australians. Some even quietly adopted selected Australian techniques. But official doctrine never endorsed the use of captured weapons. The official position remained that American equipment was superior, and American soldiers should use American equipment. The Australians ignored the official position and continued doing what worked. The AK-47 became more than a weapon for Australian SAS. It became a symbol of their operational philosophy. Adaptation over doctrine, results over appearances, mission success over institutional comfort. The weapon represented willingness to think unconventionally and act without approval. American soldiers who carried only M16s were operating within the system. Australian soldiers who carried AK-47s were operating outside. The distinction was everything. Inside the system, you had support, but also constraints. Outside the system, you had freedom, but also isolation. The Australians chose isolation because isolation provided operational advantages that support could not match. The enemy recognized the difference. Viet Cong and NVA after-action reports, captured by intelligence officers, specifically mentioned Australian tactics. Enemy forces were warned that some Allied patrols used captured weapons and could not be identified by weapon sounds. The warnings appeared in training documents and tactical briefings. The enemy had learned that not all Allied forces were the same. Some were conventional and predictable. Others were unconventional and lethal. The Australians earned a reputation as the most dangerous Allied forces in Viet Cong province. The reputation was built on consistent results achieved through methodology that confused and demoralized enemy forces. By 1968, a pattern was established. Australian SAS patrols operated with a mixture of weapons chosen for tactical advantage. They used Sterling submachine guns with integral suppressors for silent operations. They used AK-47s for acoustic deception and ammunition compatibility. They used M16s when liaison with American forces required clear identification. They used captured NVA equipment, including web gear, canteens, and field packs because enemy equipment was lighter and better designed for tropical conditions. Every piece of gear was selected based on performance rather than origin. The result was operational effectiveness that consistently exceeded conventional forces. American Special Operations began studying Australian methods more carefully by late 1968. The Studies and Observations Group The most elite American Special Operations Unit in Vietnam sent observers to Australian operations. The observers filed reports that acknowledged Australian effectiveness while expressing discomfort with Australian methods. The reports contained fascinating tension. On one hand, the Americans recognized that Australians achieved results through practices that violated American doctrine. On the other hand, the Americans were unwilling to recommend adopting those practices because adoption would require acknowledging that American doctrine was insufficient. The institutional inability to learn from allies who operated more effectively was striking. The AK-47 in Australian hands achieved something the weapon never achieved in enemy hands. It became a tool of precision rather than volume. Enemy forces fired AK-47s on full automatic, spraying bullets to suppress and terrorize. Australian operators fired AK-47s on semi-automatic, placing shots with accuracy developed through endless training. The difference reflected a philosophical divide. Enemy forces believed in firepower and intimidation. Australian forces believed in precision and efficiency. Same weapon, different methodology, radically different results. The lesson was that weapons were only as effective as the soldiers using them and the tactical frameworks within which they operated. The controversy about captured weapons obscured a deeper truth about Australian effectiveness. The weapons were symbols, but not cause. The cause was systematic adaptation to environment and mission in ways that American forces never fully embraced. Australians operated in smaller teams, which meant they moved more quietly and presented smaller targets. Australians patrolled for longer duration, which meant they developed better intelligence about enemy patterns. Australians emphasized observation over engagement, which meant they fought only when tactical advantage was overwhelming. Australians used terrain and vegetation for concealment rather than clearing fields of fire, which meant they became part of the jungle rather than intruders in the jungle. The captured weapons were just one element of comprehensive methodology built around total adaptation. The captured equipment included more than weapons. Australian patrols used NVA packs because they were lighter and more durable than American equivalents. They used captured maps because enemy maps showed trails and camps that Allied maps missed. They used captured documents to understand enemy tactics and organization. They used captured food when possible because it reduced resupply requirements. Everything the enemy carried had been designed for operating in Vietnam. Everything American forces carried had been designed for operating according to American doctrine. When a mission required operating more like an enemy than like a conventional force, enemy equipment provided advantages. The transformation in American perception came slowly and incompletely. By 1969, some American Special Operations personnel were quietly using captured AK-47s despite official prohibition. The practice was never formally acknowledged, but photographic evidence exists. American soldiers in the field with enemy weapons, operating in ways their doctrine did not officially endorse. The Australians had proven that adaptation worked. Some Americans learned the lesson. But institutional doctrine never changed because changing doctrine would require admitting that the American approach to Vietnam was flawed at a fundamental level. The admission never came. The Australian approach to captured weapons reflected broader military culture that valued pragmatism over ideology. Australian soldiers were not fighting to prove superiority of Western democracy through superior equipment. They were fighting to accomplish specific missions while bringing their mates home alive. If captured weapons helped accomplish missions and improve survival, captured weapons were good. If American weapons created disadvantages, American weapons were bad. The calculation was simple and brutal. Effectiveness mattered. Everything else was secondary. American military culture could never fully embrace that calculation because American identity was too intertwined with belief that American methods were definitionally superior. The AK-47 appeared in photographs of Australian SAS throughout the war. The images were controversial when published. Australian government officials worried about the perception that Australian soldiers were unprofessional or poorly equipped. Some photographs were suppressed. Others were released with captions emphasizing that captured weapons were used for intelligence purposes rather than combat operations. The captions were lies. The weapons were used in combat constantly, but the lies were necessary to maintain the official position that Allied forces used Allied equipment. The gap between official narrative and battlefield reality was enormous. Japanese military analysts studying the Vietnam War were fascinated by Australian use of captured weapons. Japan had faced Australian forces in World War II and remembered their tactical flexibility. Japanese post-war military studies examined why Australian forces in Vietnam achieved better results than American forces with fewer resources. The studies identified captured weapon use as a symptom of a larger difference in operational philosophy. Australians were willing to abandon doctrinal purity for tactical advantage. Americans defended doctrinal purity even when it produced tactical disadvantage. The Japanese analysts noted that Imperial Japan had made a similar mistake, insisting on Japanese methods even when circumstances demanded adaptation. The observation was pointed. The Soviet Union also studied Australian tactics. Soviet military journals published analyses of the Vietnam War that praised Australian use of Soviet-designed weapons. The praise was propaganda, but it was also recognition. The AK-47 was Mikhail Kalashnikov's design, built in Soviet factories, distributed to communist allies worldwide. Seeing Western special forces adopt the weapon as superior to American alternatives was propaganda victory. Soviet analysts understood that the weapon's adoption was not an ideological endorsement. It was a practical recognition that the AK-47 was better suited to jungle warfare than the M16, but the distinction did not matter for propaganda purposes. The images of Australian soldiers with AK-47s demonstrated that even elite Western forces recognized Soviet weapons worked. The Australian soldiers carrying captured weapons cared nothing for propaganda wars or doctrinal debates. They cared about mission success and survival. The AK-47 helped them achieve both. That was all that mattered. When they returned from patrol and American officers criticized their equipment choices, they listened politely and continued doing exactly what they had been doing. They had learned through experience what worked. They were not interested in theories from officers who had never patrolled through hostile jungle for 2 weeks with 5 men against hundreds of enemy. The gap between operational reality and command understanding was UNBRIDGEABLE. By 1970, Australian tactics were being studied by military forces worldwide. The kill ratios were too impressive to ignore. Various special operations units from Allied nations sent observers to learn Australian methods. The observers all noted the captured weapons. Some recommended adopting the practice. Most recommendations were rejected by home governments for the same reasons the American government had rejected the practice. Using enemy weapons suggested. Your own weapons were inadequate. The suggestion was politically unacceptable, so the lesson was learned incompletely. Foreign special operations forces adopted some Australian tactics while rejecting others because institutional pride prevented complete adoption. The war wound down for Australian forces in 1971. The last SAS patrols returned from the jungle carrying the same mixture of Allied and captured equipment they had carried for 5 years. They had achieved remarkable results. Over 500 confirmed enemy killed. Mission success rates exceeding 90%. Casualty rates far below comparable units. They had operated in some of the most hostile territory in Vietnam and emerged with a reputation as the most effective counterinsurgency force in theater. They had done it while violating numerous American doctrinal principles and using weapons that American officers considered dishonorable. The contradiction between methodology and results was never resolved. The Australian soldiers returned home to a country that did not fully appreciate what they had accomplished. Anti-war sentiment was strong. Vietnam veterans were not welcomed as heroes. The special operations soldiers who had achieved extraordinary results received no parades. Many were criticized for participating in unjust war. The irony was bitter. Soldiers who had been called dishonorable by American allies for using captured weapons were called dishonorable by Australian civilians for fighting at all. The disconnect between battlefield reality and civilian perception was complete. AK-47s carried by Australian SAS were returned to armories or disposed of according to regulations. Some were kept as souvenirs by soldiers who had carried them through dozens of patrols. The weapons sat in closets and storage rooms, physical reminders of time when practical necessity overrode institutional doctrine. The soldiers who kept them would occasionally clean and oil them, remembering patrols where that specific weapon had saved lives. The memories were private. The lessons were mostly unshared. Australian military culture preserved the knowledge institutionally, but did not trumpet it publicly. The methodology remained available for future conflicts, but was not advertised. American military analysts continued studying the Vietnam War for decades afterward. Thousands of studies examined why American forces struggled to defeat enemies that appeared inferior in every measurable category. The studies examined strategy, tactics, logistics, politics, culture. Most missed the simple truth that Australian SAS had demonstrated. Effectiveness in unconventional warfare requires unconventional thinking. Using captured weapons was one small example of a larger principle. Soldiers willing to abandon comfortable assumptions and adapt completely to circumstances achieved better results than soldiers defending institutional doctrine regardless of effectiveness. The principle was simple. Learning it required humility that military institutions rarely possess. Captured weapons controversy faded into historical footnote. Official histories of Australian involvement in Vietnam mentioned the practice briefly, if at all. American histories generally ignored it completely. The omission was convenient for both nations. Australians did not want to emphasize practices that seemed to validate American criticism about professionalism. Americans did not want to acknowledge that Allied forces using captured weapons had outperformed American forces using American weapons. So the story was largely forgotten, except among veterans who remembered and occasional military historians who studied operational details. The AK-47 remains in service with military forces worldwide. Modern versions are manufactured in dozens of countries. The weapon Mikhail Kalashnikov, designed in 1947, has become the most widely distributed rifle in history. Its adoption by the Australian SAS in Vietnam was a tiny footnote in the weapon's history, but the footnote illuminated a larger truth about weapons and warfare. Weapons are tools. Their effectiveness depends on context and employment. The best weapon is the weapon that best fits mission and circumstances. No weapon is universally superior. The lesson seems obviously stated plainly, but military institutions consistently fail to learn it because institutional identity becomes invested in specific weapons and methods. Admitting that other weapons might be better in specific circumstances threatens institutional identity. So the admission is avoided, and effectiveness is sacrificed to maintain comfortable beliefs. The soldiers who carried AK-47s through the Vietnamese jungle learned the lesson completely. They learned that survival required abandoning preconceptions and embracing whatever worked. They learned that honor was not defined by following rules, but by accomplishing missions and protecting teammates. They learned that effectiveness emerged from adaptation rather than adherence to doctrine. The lessons made them exceptional soldiers. The lessons also made them uncomfortable for institutions that valued conformity over results. The tension was never resolved. Exceptional soldiers operated at margins of institutional acceptance, tolerated because of results, but never fully. Embraced because their methods challenged foundational assumptions. The story of Australian SAS using captured weapons is ultimately a story about military effectiveness and institutional resistance. A small group of soldiers discovered that effectiveness in specific circumstances required violating institutional norms. They violated those norms and achieved remarkable results. The institution studied those results, acknowledged their validity, but refused to change norms because changing norms would require admitting that institutional wisdom was incomplete. So the exceptional soldiers remained exceptional, and the institution remained unchanged. The pattern repeats throughout military history. Innovation comes from margins. Institutions resist innovation. Eventually innovation is absorbed, but only after institutional pride has been satisfied through passage of time and generational change. The AK-47 sits silent in museums now. Display cases with plaques explaining the weapon's technical specifications and historical significance. Visitors look at the crude stamped metal and wonder how this simple design became so influential. The answer is context and adaptation. The AK-47 worked because it was designed for specific circumstances and built to function regardless of conditions. Australian SAS recognized those qualities and exploited them. They understood that the weapon was not ideologically communist or democratically Western. It was simply effective. That understanding made them better soldiers. It also made them an uncomfortable reminder that effectiveness and ideology do not always align. The jungle has reclaimed the battlefields where Australian SAS operated with captured weapons. The trails they patrolled are overgrown, the ambush. Sites are unmarked. The places where AK-47s fired in Australian hands against enemy forces are indistinguishable from surrounding forest. But the lessons remain in institutional memory, preserved by soldiers who learned them and passed them to new generations. The lessons are simple. Adapt to circumstances. Use what works. Abandon what fails. Value results over appearances. Those lessons made five-man Australian patrols more effective than company-sized American operations. Those lessons remain valid. In any conflict where unconventional challenges require unconventional solutions, the controversy about captured weapons was ultimately a controversy about military identity. American forces defined professionalism through standardization and uniformity. Australian forces defined professionalism through effectiveness and adaptation. Both definitions were valid in their own contexts. Neither was universally superior. The mistake was assuming that one definition should dominate all contexts. American definition worked well in conventional warfare where logistics and firepower determined outcomes. Australian definition worked better in unconventional warfare where adaptation and stealth determined outcomes. The mistake was institutional. Inability to recognize that different contexts required different approaches. That inability cost lives and reduced effectiveness throughout the Vietnam War. The final patrol returned in 1971. The soldiers carried AK-47s and Sterling, submachine guns, and captured NVA packs. They had completed their mission with 0 casualties and enemy losses in double digits. They were met by Australian officers who understood what they had accomplished and American advisors who would file reports expressing concern about their methods. The scene was familiar. It had played out hundreds of times during 5 years of operations. Nothing had changed except that the war was ending. The lessons would be preserved in classified reports and veteran memories. Whether anyone would learn from those lessons remained uncertain. History suggested that institutions learned slowly and incompletely, that future soldiers would have to relearn through blood and experience what previous soldiers had already discovered. The cycle would continue because military institutions resisted lessons that challenged core assumptions about how wars should be fought and what made soldiers professional. The AK-47 was just a weapon, stamped metal and machine parts. But in the hands of the Australian SAS in Vietnam, it became a symbol of everything that made them effective and everything that made them controversial. The weapon represented willingness to think unconventionally, to abandon comfortable assumptions, to embrace whatever worked regardless of origin or appearance. The weapon represented adaptation over doctrine, results over rules, effectiveness over institutional approval. Those qualities made Australian SAS among the most effective counterinsurgency forces in Vietnam. Those same qualities made them uncomfortable for allies who valued conformity and doctrinal purity. The contradiction was never resolved because resolving it would require acknowledging that military effectiveness is contextual and that no single approach dominates all circumstances. The acknowledgement would threaten institutional certainty. So the controversy persisted, fading into history unresolved, waiting to re-emerge in future conflicts when exceptional soldiers again discover that effectiveness requires violating norms, and institutions again resist learning from results. The pattern is eternal. The AK-47 in Australian hands was just one more iteration of the pattern, remarkable only for how clearly it illuminated the gap between what works and what institutions are willing to accept as working. The weapon hangs in museums now, silent and simple, carrying weight of lessons that should have been learned, but mostly were not. Testament to the reality that sometimes the most dishonorable choice is abandoning effectiveness to maintain appearances of honor, and the most honorable choice is achieving mission success regardless of what comfortable observers think about your methods. The Australian SAS made that choice repeatedly. They were called dishonorable for it. Then they proved through. Results that honor defined by effectiveness matters more than honor defined by conformity. The proof remains, carved into casualty statistics and mission records, waiting for future soldiers to rediscover when circumstances again demand choosing between doctrine and results, between institutional approval and mission success, between carrying the right weapons according to regulations or carrying the effective weapons according to reality. The choice seems obvious in retrospect. It never seems obvious at the time. That is why the lessons must be learned again and again. Why the AK-47 in Australian hands matters as a historical symbol. Why remembering uncomfortable truths about military effectiveness matters more than maintaining comfortable myths about superiority and honor. The jungle remembers. The weapon remembers. The question is whether institutions will remember, or whether future soldiers will pay in blood to learn what the Australians already taught through their willingness to be called dishonorable by allies, while being called lethal by enemies. That distinction, ultimately, is the only one that matters when lives depend on choices made in hostile places where ideology means nothing and effectiveness means everything.